Title: Voices Beneath the Waves. The waves whispered secrets that only the daring could hear. Tonight, the sea held its breath, and so did Mr. Satterthwaite, unaware that his life was about to be swept away by a tide of the extraordinary. Mr. Satterthwaite sat alone, his thoughts adrift like an unmoored ship lost in the vast, uncertain sea of life. The room, with its dim amber glow from an antique lamp, reflected the quiet melancholy of his soul. At 69 he bore the label of old, like an ill-fitting coat, not entirely comfortable but undeniably his. To the outside world he was a man of stature, wealth, and taste. His name appeared on guest lists for the finest galas, and his collection of art was the envy of many. But behind the carefully curated veneer lay a void that no amount of luxury could fill. This evening he found himself contemplating that very void. The stillness of his grand home amplified the whispers of his heart, whispers that spoke of choices not taken, roads not traveled. He had been a spectator to life, a connoisseur of human drama, always at the periphery but never truly involved. Perhaps, he thought, this is the curse of being an observer, to see everything but to feel so little of it. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its warmth failing to reach the cold corners of his mind. He sipped his brandy, the amber liquid swirling like the tide, bringing with it fleeting comfort. His gaze fell upon a painting, an old seascape depicting a turbulent ocean, dark and foreboding. It had always been his favorite piece, a reminder of life's unpredictability and power. Tonight, however, it felt different, as though the waves were moving, calling out to him in some primal, ancient tongue. His solitude was abruptly interrupted by a sound that didn't belong. A soft knock at the door echoed through the empty halls. Mr. Satterthwaite's brow furrowed. It was late, far too late for visitors. Rising with a slight groan, the protest of old joints unused to sudden motion, he made his way to the door. When he opened it, the night greeted him with a sharp, salty breeze. Standing there were two men, drenched from head to toe, their clothes clinging to their frames as though they had emerged straight from the sea. One was tall and gaunt, with eyes like twin storms, gray and unrelenting. The other was shorter, stockier, his face weathered by years of hardship but softened by a kind smile. Both seemed to carry an air of the extraordinary, as if they belonged to a different world altogether. "Good evening," the taller man said, his voice deep and resonant, cutting through the stillness of the night. "We apologize for the intrusion, but we need your help." Mr. Satterthwaite's instinct was to dismiss them, to close the door and retreat to the safety of his cocoon. Yet something in their eyes held him in place. It was not desperation or malice, but a quiet determination, an unspoken promise of mystery and intrigue, a chance, perhaps, to step into a story rather than merely observe one. "What kind of help?" he asked, his voice betraying both curiosity and caution. The shorter man stepped forward, removing his hat and clutching it tightly in his hands. "There's no easy way to explain this, sir, but if you let us in, we can tell you a tale that will change your life forever." And so, against all reason, Mr. Satterthwaite stepped aside, allowing the men from the sea to cross the threshold. Little did he know that this decision would shatter the monotony of his existence, plunging him into a world of secrets, danger, and revelations that would challenge everything he thought he knew about life and himself. The Duchess's letter offered a temporary distraction, her sharp wit and extravagant charm almost audible in her words. She teased him for his luxurious island retreat, accusing him of becoming too absorbed in his own comfort. "Your inordinate interest in other people's affairs might save you yet," she had written, a truth that both amused and stung him. It was this very interest, this fascination with the lives and dramas of others that had defined him. From duchesses to young singers like Olga, whom he had helped rise to stardom, he had been a patron, a confidant, a silent architect of others' success. And yet, as he walked down the vivid bougainvillea-lined avenue toward the harbor, even the riotous scarlet blossoms seemed to mock him, their vibrancy a cruel contrast to his graying existence. The dog's sudden death struck him with an unexpected wave of sorrow, a poignant reminder of life's cruelty and unpredictability. The poor creature's reproachful eyes haunted him, their silent question echoing in his mind. Why has this world, so full of promise, betrayed me? He carried that sadness with him as he wandered past the black lava beach, the frothy surf crashing against the rocks, its endless rhythm a metaphor for life's relentless forward march. La Paz awaited him at the top of the cliff, a house shrouded in mystery, its beautiful garden and cypress-lined walk offering him a peculiar solace. He often speculated about the villa's owner, weaving romantic tales of a reclusive Spanish dancer who had once dazzled the world, but now chose seclusion to hide her faded beauty. It was a comforting fantasy, one he preferred over the mundane truth. Sitting on the edge of the cliff, staring down at the abyss below, he felt a strange mixture of awe and despair. The sea stretched endlessly before him, its deep blue depths holding secrets he would never uncover. It reminded him of Tristan and Isolde, their tragic love story resonating with his own sense of unfulfilled yearning. For all his accomplishments, all his connections, what had he truly gained from life? Nothing of substance, not even the fleeting joy that the now dead dog might have experienced in his final moments rolling blissfully in a heap of rubbish. The thought chilled him, the vast emptiness within him mirrored by the yawning chasm below, an unexpected intrusion. Lost in his thoughts, Mr. Satterthwaite was startled by an unfamiliar sound. Footsteps. The abrupt intrusion broke the stillness, followed by an exasperated "damn." Turning, he found himself face to face with the man who had arrived at the island the day before. The stranger was an enigma, a man nearing 50 yet carrying an air of immaturity, as though he had stubbornly refused to grow up. His florid face, round brown eyes, and fair hair streaked with gray gave him the appearance of someone who had always indulged in life's pleasures without restraint. Yet, for all his charm and disarming smile, Mr. Satterthwaite couldn't quite place him. He seemed out of sync with the island's tranquil monotony, more suited to the vibrant chaos of a hunt or a polo match. The man's sheepish apology for his outburst carried an odd sincerity, and his warm smile hinted at a depth Mr. Satterthwaite had not initially perceived. But what had brought such a man to this quiet, unremarkable island? Surely not the art, nor the barren social scene. Perhaps, Mr. Satterthwaite mused, there was more to this stranger than met the eye. A hidden story waiting to be unraveled. A mystery that might provide him, if only briefly, with a distraction from his own. Mr. Satterthwaite leaned forward, his gaze piercing as he surveyed the young man's troubled expression. It was not the first time he had encountered such turmoil in a stranger's soul, and it would not be the last. The bench creaked slightly as he adjusted his position, a faint smile curving his lips. "It is rather a lonely spot," he observed, his tone light, yet laden with meaning. Anthony Cosden, for that was his name, shifted slightly, his stick prodding aimlessly at the ground. "Lonely? I wouldn't know about that. There always seems to be someone here," he muttered, his voice carrying an undertone of resentment that was impossible to miss. It piqued Mr. Satterthwaite's curiosity further, setting his sharp mind into motion. "You've been here before, then?" asked Mr. Satterthwaite, his question casual yet deliberate, designed to probe deeper without alarming his companion. Anthony hesitated. "I was up here last night, after dinner," he admitted, almost grudgingly. "Last night? But the gates are always locked after dark. Surely you didn't." "I climbed the wall," Anthony interrupted, his tone defiant. There it was again, that flicker of bewildered defiance, as though the world had turned on him without warning. Mr. Satterthwaite's interest sharpened. Why this secretive excursion? And what had drawn him here, of all places, in the dead of night? Almost involuntarily, his eyes drifted to the villa with its green shutters, serene and impenetrable. But no answers lay there. "And you actually found someone here?" Mr. Satterthwaite ventured. Anthony nodded. "Yes, must have been from the other hotel. He was dressed in some sort of fancy costume." "Fancy dress? What kind?" The question burst from Mr. Satterthwaite's lips before he could stop it. The mention of costumes had struck a chord, a note of something familiar and significant. "A harlequin outfit," Anthony replied, puzzled by the older man's sudden intensity. "They do have costume parties, don't they?" But Mr. Satterthwaite barely heard him. His mind was racing, piecing together fragments of memory and intuition. "Catalysis," he murmured, almost to himself. "What's that?" Anthony asked, bewildered. Mr. Satterthwaite's gaze turned inward, his voice taking on a measured gravity. "A chemical reaction, dependent on the presence of a substance that itself remains unchanged. That's my friend, Mr. Quint. He's the catalyst. His presence heralds revelations, transformations. And yet, he remains untouched, uninvolved." Anthony stared at him, nonplussed. "He's an odd sort of fellow, then. Gave me quite a fright, popping up out of nowhere, almost as if he emerged from the sea itself." Mr. Satterthwaite followed Anthony's gaze to the sheer drop below. "An ideal spot for a murder," he remarked, his tone deceptively pleasant. Anthony flinched, the casual remark landing with unsettling weight. He began to fidget, his stick tapping nervously against the stones. "It's nonsense, of course," he muttered. "But it's the feeling he gave me, as though he belonged to another world." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mr. Satterthwaite's keen eyes studied Anthony's profile, noting the shadow of something deeper, more personal. It reminded him of a dog he had once seen, hit by a car, staring up with eyes full of wounded bewilderment. The same unspoken plea echoed now in Anthony's gaze. "Oh, world that I trusted, what have you done to me?" Finally, Anthony broke the silence. "You know, one wonders what it's all for." Mr. Satterthwaite did not smile. He knew that tone, that question. It was not curiosity but despair, a despair that sought meaning where none seemed to exist. "They say every man should build a house, plant a tree, and have a son," Anthony continued, his voice tinged with irony. "I believe I planted an acorn once." "And the house? The son?" Mr. Satterthwaite prompted gently, sensing the opening to delve deeper. Anthony's laugh was hollow. "No house, no son, just me and 6 months to live." The words hung in the air, stark and unembellished. 6 months. Mr. Satterthwaite's heart tightened with a pang of understanding. The diagnosis had been delivered with all the clinical detachment of modern medicine, yet its impact had shattered Anthony's carefree existence. The world, once vibrant and full of promise, had turned cold and gray. "It's a bit difficult to take in," Anthony confessed. "Waiting around for the end, it's not my style. I thought I'd carry on as usual, but it doesn't work." "No woman?" Mr. Satterthwaite asked delicately. Anthony shook his head. "Not that kind. My crowd, they're all about good times. They wouldn't want a walking funeral." "And so you came here," Mr. Satterthwaite surmised, "to this spot, one step to eternity." Anthony's head jerked up, his eyes wide with alarm. "I say, really? Last night," Mr. Satterthwaite continued, his voice calm and measured, "you met someone who stopped you. And this afternoon you met me. Twice now, your life has been spared. Perhaps there is a reason for that." Anthony's face darkened. "It's my life," he snapped. "I have the right to end it if I choose." "A cliché," Mr. Satterthwaite said wearily. "An excuse, not a reason. Life is seldom about rights. It's about choices, and the consequences of those choices." For a moment, Anthony said nothing. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his turmoil. "Maybe you're right. Maybe there's something left, something I haven't seen yet." Mr. Satterthwaite smiled faintly. "Perhaps there is. And perhaps, if you're willing to wait, my friend Mr. Quinn will show you what it is." "If you had—" Mr. Satterthwaite's sharp tone cut through the air like a whip. His eyes bore into Cosden, waiting for the man to continue. Cosden exhaled deeply, a man burdened by invisible chains. "I don't know," he said hesitantly. "Even then, I think this way would be best. But anyway, I haven't." His words trailed off, leaving an air of unresolved tension. Mr. Satterthwaite's eyes narrowed as his sharp instincts kicked in. Was there, perhaps, something, or someone, left unsaid? He leaned in slightly, his curiosity sharpening. "Are you sure there isn't a woman in this story?" Cosden gave a hollow laugh. "No," he said flatly. "Not that kind of woman, at least. My life's been good, you know. On the whole, I've had a great run. Plenty of everything, except—" He paused, his voice faltering, and then he muttered almost wistfully, "except a son. I always wanted a son, a part of me to live on after—" He stopped, his lips pressing together in a hard line. At this point, something inside Mr. Satterthwaite snapped. "A good life?" he said sharply, his tone carrying a tinge of mockery. "How can you call it a good life when you've barely started living? You haven't even scratched the surface." Cosden frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'm 40. My hair's gray. That's hardly the beginning." Mr. Satterthwaite shook his head with fervor. "Age means nothing. You're still in the larval stage of life, barely out of the cocoon. Life is a kaleidoscope of experiences, a journey of seasons. You've only seen one season, winter perhaps. What of spring's blooms? The lazy days of summer? The crisp, golden leaves of autumn? You haven't lived until you've experienced them all." Cosden gave a faint, sardonic smile. "Easy for you to say. You're not staring at 6 months of borrowed time." "Time is relative," Mr. Satterthwaite countered. His voice was firm, unwavering. 6 months can hold more life than 60 years if you let it. But you're ready to throw it all away. For what? For fear of facing the unknown? Cosden looked away, visibly uncomfortable. "In my place, you'd do the same." Mr. Satterthwaite's expression softened, but his resolve didn't waver. "No," he said quietly, "I wouldn't. Not because I'm braver than you, but because I'm curious. I'd want to know what happens tomorrow, and the day after that. Every sunrise holds a promise, every day a possibility, and even at 69 I'm not ready to stop discovering." Cosden let out a sudden laugh, but it lacked mirth. "Well, sir, you've been patient enough listening to me ramble on. I've said too much already. Forget all of it." He stood abruptly, brushing off invisible dust from his jacket. "And when they find my body tomorrow, you can rest assured. I'll make sure you're not implicated." Mr. Satterthwaite's gaze sharpened like a blade. "You're wrong, my boy. You think I can't stop you, and you're right. I can't follow you like a shadow. But for today, you're not jumping. I'm here, and if you try, it will look far too suspicious. The world may think me a murderer." Cosden hesitated, visibly unnerved. "I suppose you've got me there," he admitted reluctantly. "All right, you've won, for now, but this isn't over." He tipped his head with a small, bitter smile. "Goodbye, for now." As he walked away, Mr. Satterthwaite stayed rooted to his spot, staring at the sea, lost in thought. "What next?" he murmured to himself. "There must be a next. There always is." He turned back toward the villa, his eyes narrowing at the shuttered windows. What secrets did this place hold? What stories were locked behind those faded green shutters? On impulse, he climbed the crumbling stone steps and pushed gently against one of them. To his surprise, it swung open easily. And then he froze. A woman stood in the window, her figure framed like a painting. She was draped in black, a lace mantilla casting delicate shadows over her serene yet sorrowful face. Her eyes, deep and unreadable, met his with a steady gaze. Flustered, Mr. Satterthwaite stumbled into a flurry of half-remembered Italian and German phrases, bowing awkwardly. "Signora, I am so sorry. I didn't mean to intrude." His words tumbled over each other as he retreated, his face burning with embarrassment. The woman said nothing, not a single word. She simply watched him, her silence more powerful than any speech. He was halfway across the courtyard when her voice lashed out like the crack of a pistol. "Come back!" It wasn't a request, it wasn't even an invitation. It was a command, sharp, absolute, and unrelenting. The tone was the kind one might use on a disobedient dog. And yet, before Mr. Satterthwaite had time to process it, his body had already obeyed. He turned on his heel and hurried back to the window, his movements automatic, almost instinctive. Only when he stood before her again did he feel a flicker of indignation. What am I doing, trotting back like a scolded pup? But by then it was too late. She stood motionless in the window, her dark eyes scanning him from head to toe. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the kind of look that stripped a person bare, peeling back layers until there was nothing left to hide. "You are English," she said at last, her voice calm and certain. "I thought so." Mr. Satterthwaite, still flustered, launched into another hurried apology. "If I had known you were English," he stammered, "I could have expressed myself far better earlier. I offer my sincerest apologies for my rudeness in attempting to open the shutter. I have no excuse except curiosity. I simply couldn't resist seeing what the inside of this charming house might look like." Her response was unexpected. She threw back her head and laughed, a deep, rich sound that seemed to fill the air around them. "If you really want to see it," she said, her lips curling into a faint smile, "then you had better come inside." She stepped aside, and Mr. Satterthwaite, feeling a strange thrill of excitement, crossed the threshold. The room was dimly lit, its only light filtering in through the half-open shutter. The air was heavy with dust, and the furniture was sparse, shabbily worn, and draped in neglect. "Not here," she said briskly. "I don't use this room." Without waiting for a response, she turned and led the way across a narrow passage. Mr. Satterthwaite followed, feeling like a character in a Gothic novel. The house was steeped in mystery, and so was this woman. The next room was completely different. The windows were flung open, flooding the space with sunlight. The sea sparkled in the distance, casting rippling reflections on the walls. The furniture was still simple, but there was an effort here. A few worn but elegant rugs, a large Spanish leather screen, and fresh flowers arranged in delicate bowls. The scent of the blooms filled the air, mingling with the salty breeze. "You will have tea with me," she said suddenly. It wasn't a question, it was a declaration. Then, as if anticipating his unspoken doubt, she added, "It will be proper tea, made with boiling water. You have my word." She stepped out momentarily, calling something in rapid Spanish to someone unseen. When she returned, she settled onto a sofa opposite him, her presence commanding yet unhurried. It was the first time Mr. Satterthwaite had a chance to really look at her. She was tall and sunburnt, her skin weathered by time and the elements. She was dark-haired, undeniably handsome, and carried an energy that was both magnetic and intimidating. Though she wasn't young, her vitality was palpable. It radiated from her like a tangible force. In her presence, Mr. Satterthwaite felt his usual insecurities creeping in. He felt old, shrunken, and pale by comparison. And yet, as the moments passed, he began to feel something else, a warmth, a strange sense of being revived. "She's got so much life in her," he thought. "It spills over to those around her." He couldn't help but wish some of that vitality could rub off on Olga, his timid protégée. What an Isolde she'd make, he mused. And yet, life is cruel. She probably can't sing a note. Everything in life is arranged so badly. But even as he admired her, a small part of him bristled. He didn't like domineering women, and there was no doubt she was one. She had been studying him as well, her chin resting on her hands, her gaze direct and unapologetic. At last, she nodded, as though coming to a decision. "I'm glad you came," she said suddenly. "I needed someone to talk to, and you, well, you're used to that, aren't you?" Mr. Satterthwaite blinked. "I don't quite follow." "Oh, don't play coy," she said impatiently. "People tell you things. You're one of those types, half a woman. You understand what we feel, what we think, the strange, irrational things we do. You know exactly what I mean, don't you?" He opened his mouth to protest, but she swept on, giving him no chance to respond. Her words came in a rush, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "One could say anything to you, anything, because you'd listen, you'd understand." The room fell silent as her voice faded. A moment later, a smiling Spanish girl appeared, carrying a tray of tea. The scent of fresh-brewed China tea filled the air, and Mr. Satterthwaite sipped his cup gratefully. "You live here?" he asked, eager to steer the conversation to safer ground. "Yes," she said simply, "but not all the time. The house is usually closed up, isn't it? At least, that's what I've heard." "I'm here more often than people think," she admitted. "But I only use these rooms." "Have you owned it long?" "For 22 years, she said. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "And I lived here for a year before that." Mr. Satterthwaite, feeling slightly awkward, said the first thing that came to mind. "That's a very long time." She tilted her head, her dark eyes gleaming. "What year? Or the 22 years?" Intrigued, he leaned forward. "I suppose that depends." She nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Yes, it depends. They're two entirely different periods, separate from one another. Which is long, which is short? Even now, I can't say." She was silent for a moment, lost in thought, her face shadowed with something deep and unspoken. Then, with the faintest of smiles, she broke the stillness. "It has been such a long time since I've talked with anyone. Such a long time. I do not apologize. After all, you came to my shutter. You wanted to look through my window. And isn't that what you always do? Pushing aside the shutters and peeking through windows into the truths of people's lives. If they let you. And often, even when they don't. You're good at it. It would be hard to hide anything from you. You would guess, and you would guess right." Mr. Satterthwaite felt something stir within him, a rare impulse to be entirely sincere. "I am 69, he said quietly, Everything I know of life, I know at second hand. Sometimes that feels unbearably bitter, and yet it means I know a great deal. She nodded, her gaze sharpening with a knowing light. I know. Life is very strange. I cannot imagine what it must be like to be that, always the looker-on. Her voice carried a tinge of wonder, and for a moment Mr. Satterthwaite smiled. No, you wouldn't know. Your place has always been at the center of the stage. You're the prima donna. The spotlight finds you, whether you seek it or not. She tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. What a curious thing to say. But true, he replied, his voice steady. Things have happened to you. Things will always happen to you. Tragic things, perhaps? Am I right? Her eyes narrowed, and she leaned in slightly, her presence suddenly more intense. If you stay here long, someone will tell you the story of the English swimmer who drowned at the foot of this cliff. They'll tell you how young and strong he was, how handsome. They'll tell you how his young wife stood at the top of the cliff and watched as he drowned. Mr. Satterthwaite nodded. Yes, I've already heard that story. Her gaze locked onto his, unflinching. That man was my husband. This was his villa. He brought me here when I was 18, and a year later he died, thrown by the surf onto the black rocks, cut, bruised, battered to death by the sea. Mr. Satterthwaite gasped, a shocked exclamation escaping his lips. But she pressed on, her voice gaining a sharp edge. Can you imagine a greater tragedy than that? For a young wife, only a year married, to stand helpless while the man she loved fought for his life, and lost it? Horribly lost it. Terrible, Mr. Satterthwaite murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I cannot think of anything more dreadful. And then, suddenly, she laughed. It was a raw, unrestrained sound that sliced through the room like a blade. She leaned back, her face alive with bitter amusement. You're wrong, she said, her voice ringing with something dark and chilling. There is something worse. For a young wife to stand there and hope and pray that her husband will drown. Mr. Satterthwaite's breath caught. Good God, you don't mean... Yes, I do. Her voice was low, but it struck him like a hammer. That's what it really was. I knelt there on the cliff, and I prayed. The Spanish servants thought I was praying for his life to be saved. I wasn't. I was praying that I could want him to live. I was saying it over and over. God, help me not to wish him dead. God, help me not to wish him dead. But it wasn't any use. All the while I hoped, and my hope came true. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She fell silent for a long moment, then spoke again, her voice soft and almost detached. It's a terrible thing, isn't it? The kind of thing you can't forget. I was so happy when I knew he was really dead that he couldn't come back to hurt me anymore. Mr. Satterthwaite's face was pale. My child, he said, his voice trembling. She looked at him, her eyes filled with something raw and haunting. I know. I was too young to have that happen to me. Those things, they should come when you're older, when you're more prepared for the beastliness of life. Nobody knew what he was really like. I thought he was wonderful when I met him. I was so proud when he asked me to marry him. But it all went wrong almost immediately. He was angry with me. Nothing I did pleased him, though I tried so hard. And then he began to enjoy hurting me. Above all, he loved terrifying me. Her eyes darkened, and her voice dropped to a whisper. He thought up dreadful things to do to me. Cruelty became his hobby. And the worst of it? My baby. I was going to have a baby, but because of what he did, it was born dead. My little baby. I nearly died too, but I didn't. I wish I had. Mr. Satterthwaite made an inarticulate sound of protest, but she silenced him with a look. And then I was delivered, in the way I've told you. Some girls from the hotel dared him to swim. The Spaniards warned him about the sea, but he was vain. He wanted to show off. And I stood there and watched him drown, and I was glad. God oughtn't to let such things happen, but he does. Without thinking, Mr. Satterthwaite reached out and took her hand. She squeezed it tightly, like a frightened child. For a moment, he saw her as she must have been at 19, young, terrified, and utterly alone. At first, it was like heaven. The house was mine. I could live in it. No one could hurt me any more. I woke up every morning knowing there was no more pain, no more terror. It was bliss. But human beings are never satisfied. After a while, I got lonely. I thought about my baby. I wanted it. Wanted something to love, to play with. It sounds childish, but it was true. I understand, said Mr. Satterthwaite gravely. And then there was a young Englishman at the hotel. He wandered into the garden by mistake. I was dressed in Spanish clothes, and he thought I was a Spanish girl. I decided to play along. It was fun. We pretended the villa was ours, that we were just married and moving in. It felt like a fairy tale. And the best part? It wasn't real. It was safe because it wasn't real. She paused, her expression wistful. We went on pretending, and then he left. I never saw him again. But 9 months later, my baby was born, a beautiful boy. I named him John. He's 20 now, and the best son a mother could hope for. I told him his father died before he was born. And that young Englishman? He'll never know what he gave me. He wouldn't care anyway. I was just a passing amusement to him. And yet, said Mr. Satterthwaite softly, he gave you the one thing you wanted most. She smiled, her eyes glistening. Yes, and for that, I'll always be grateful. Mr. Satterthwaite stared at her, his sharp eyes piercing through the layers of her carefully constructed facade. A curious story indeed, yet one that somehow felt incomplete. He sensed it, an untold truth lingering in the air like an unspoken word. 20 years is a long time, he said thoughtfully. You've never considered marrying again? Her reaction was immediate. She shook her head, and a slow burning blush crept over her sun-kissed cheeks. A deep silence filled the room, only broken by his soft, probing voice. The child was enough for you, always? He asked, his tone tinged with curiosity. Her eyes softened, a rare vulnerability emerging as she met his gaze. Such queer things happen, she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Such queer things. You wouldn't believe them. No, I'm wrong. You might. Perhaps. I didn't love John's father, not then. I don't think I even knew what love was. I assumed, as a matter of course, that the child would be like me, but he wasn't. Her voice trembled, growing more intense with every word. He was his father's child, completely. Through him I learned to know that man, and through that knowledge I learned to love him. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her voice now a torrent of emotion. I love him now. I always shall. You may say it's imagination, an ideal I've built, but it's not. I love the man, the real, human man. I'd know him if I saw him tomorrow, even though it's been over 20 years. Loving him has made me into a woman. For 20 years I've lived loving him, and I shall die loving him. She paused abruptly, her gaze challenging, almost defiant. Do you think I'm mad to say these strange things? Mr. Satterthwaite took her hand, his voice gentle yet resolute. Oh, my dear, I think I understand. But there's something more, isn't there? Something you haven't yet told me? Her expression darkened, and she hesitated before responding. Yes, there is something more. It was clever of you to guess. I knew at once you weren't the sort one can hide things from. But I don't want to tell you. And the reason I don't want to is because it's best for you not to know." He studied her closely, her defiance a thin veil over her inner turmoil. "This is the test," he thought. "All the clues are in my hand. I ought to be able to know. If I reason rightly, I shall know. Something's gone wrong," he said slowly, his voice deliberate. He saw her eyelids flicker, the faintest betrayal of emotion. Something's gone wrong, suddenly, after all these years. He felt himself groping in the dark recesses of her mind, searching for the truth she was so desperately trying to hide. "The boy, it's got to do with him. You wouldn't mind about anything else." Her sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. It was a cruel business, but necessary. Her dominant will clashed against his quiet determination, but he pressed on, driven by a sense of purpose. "It is better for me not to know, you say. Better for me? But you are not a very considerate woman. You would not shrink from putting a stranger to a little temporary inconvenience. It is more than that, then, if you tell me you make me an accomplice before the fact. That sounds like crime. Fantastic. I could not associate crime with you. Or only one sort of crime. A crime against yourself." Her composure faltered, and he seized the moment, his voice now a commanding force. "It is that, then. You are thinking of taking your life." Her cry was low and anguished. "How did you know? How did you know?" "But why?" he demanded. "You are not tired of life. I never saw a woman less tired of it, more radiantly alive." She turned away, pacing to the window. "Since you have guessed so much, I might as well tell you the truth. It's the boy. He knows nothing. But last time he was home he spoke tragically of a friend. I discovered something. If he finds out he is illegitimate, it will break his heart. He is proud, horribly proud. There is a girl, and her parents naturally want to know about his father. He is coming soon, asking questions, and when he discovers the truth, he will ruin his life." Her voice broke as she continued. "If, before he comes, there has been an accident, everything will be swallowed up in grief for me. He will never suspect the truth. It's the best way. One must pay for happiness, and I've had so much happiness. The price will be easy, a little courage, a moment of anguish. But, my dear child, don't argue with me," she flared. "My life is my own. Up to now it has been needed, for John, but he needs it no longer. My death will be of use." "Are you sure?" His tone was sharp, almost severe. "You say your life is your own, but can you dare to ignore the chance that you are part of a greater drama? Your cue may not come until the end of the play, but upon it may hang the entire outcome. Your mere presence might save someone's life years from now. Can you take that risk?" She stared at him, the weight of his words settling heavily. "What do you want me to do?" she asked simply. "Promise me one thing. To do nothing rash for 24 hours. She hesitated, then nodded. "I promise." "And one more thing," he added. "Leave the shutter unfastened tonight and keep vigil in the room where I came in." She agreed, her curiosity piqued, and with that, he left, his heart pounding with the weight of what lay ahead. He knew this night held the key to everything. As he approached the hotel terrace, he spotted Anthony Cosden sitting alone, his face etched with sorrow. Tremendous issues lay in Mr. Satterthwaite's hands, and he vowed not to falter. The truth, however cruel or strange, had to come to light. Mr. Satterthwaite thought to himself, "This must be harder for him than it would ever be for me." Imagination, conjecture, speculation, they soften pain, spread it out like a canvas where you can choose the brushstrokes. But blind, raw suffering, like that of an animal, uncharted and pure, That is truly unbearable. Cosden's voice shattered the silence, raw and grating. I'm going for a stroll after dinner. You hear me? The third time's lucky. And for God's sake, don't interfere. Your meddling might be well-meaning, but trust me, it'll be useless. Mr. Satterthwaite straightened his back, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. I never interfere, he said, betraying the very essence of his existence, a life lived as a stagehand in the dramas of others. Cosden smirked bitterly. I know what you're thinking. But Mr. Satterthwaite cut him off, his voice firm, almost challenging. Number, you don't. Nobody does. Nobody ever truly knows what another person is thinking. They assume, and they're nearly always wrong. For a moment, Cosden faltered. Doubt flickered in his eyes like a flame about to extinguish. Thought is yours alone, Mr. Satterthwaite continued, his tone almost hypnotic. No one can alter it or shape what you intend to do with it. But enough of this pain. Let's turn to something lighter. That villa, for instance. It hides something, don't you think? A mystery wrapped in its walls, secluded and withdrawn from the world. I'll admit it tempted me, enough to try one of its shutters. Cosden turned sharply. You did? But surely it was locked. No. Satterthwaite's voice softened, deliberate. It was open, the third shutter from the end. Cosden froze. His face betrayed something, a memory, a realization, before he abruptly turned away. But Mr. Satterthwaite had seen it, the light in his eyes, the sudden surge of emotion. Satisfied, he rose. He had played his lines carefully, purposefully. Like a seasoned actor delivering a pivotal monologue, he knew their weight. Cosden would try that shutter tonight. He wouldn't resist. It wasn't in human nature to let a memory linger unanswered. As the night settled, Satterthwaite mused, I'll know by morning. The next morning. The garden of La Paz shimmered under the sun's golden rays. Manuel greeted Satterthwaite with a warm smile and a single rosebud. He tucked it into his buttonhole, savoring the tranquility. But as he gazed at the villa, a thought gnawed at him. Had it all been a dream? Then she appeared. The woman who had occupied his thoughts emerged, radiant and transformed. She moved with the confidence of someone carried by the tide of destiny. Her eyes sparkled like stars, her cheeks flushed with life. She was a living embodiment of joy, a goddess descended from a frieze. Without hesitation, she approached him and placed her hands on his shoulders, kissing him, not once, but over and over. Her warmth enveloped him, her happiness surging like waves crashing against the shore. "Oh, you magician!" she exclaimed breathlessly. "How did you know? How could you know? You're like the good wizard from my childhood fairy tales." Her words tumbled out in a torrent of excitement. "We're getting married today. Today. We'll go to the consul, and when John comes, his father will be there. We'll say it was all a misunderstanding. Oh, he won't ask questions. I'm so happy, so very happy." Her happiness was infectious, almost overwhelming. It spilled over, wrapping around Mr. Satterthwaite like a warm, golden light. "You've done something extraordinary," he said softly. "If you can bring him happiness in these last months, you'll have achieved something truly beautiful." Her smile faltered. "Last months?" she repeated, almost mockingly. "You don't think I'd let him die, do you? After all these years, now that he's finally come back to me. Doctors can be wrong. They're often wrong." Her voice was a mixture of defiance and faith, her vitality radiating like the sun. "He won't die, not if I can help it, not while I'm here." Satterthwaite looked at her strength and will, and for the first time he believed her. "No," he said finally, his voice soft with awe. "Somehow, I don't think he will." Later that day, On a bench overlooking the sea, Mr. Quinn was waiting. As always, he was a shadow, a figure of mystery, his dark eyes both smiling and sad. "You expected me," Quinn said simply. "Yes," Satterthwaite replied. "I expected you." They sat together, the silence between them charged with meaning. "I suppose you've been playing Providence again?" Quinn asked, his tone teasing. Satterthwaite raised an eyebrow. "As if you don't already know." Quinn smiled faintly, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "You always accuse me of omniscience. Why were you here the other night, then?" Satterthwaite pressed. "Waiting?" Quinn's expression darkened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I had a commission to perform." "For whom?" "You've called me an advocate for the dead before, haven't you?" "The dead?" Satterthwaite frowned. "I don't understand." Quinn pointed to the cliffs below. "A man drowned there 22 years ago. He loved her, you know. Loved her so much it drove him mad. He couldn't reach the woman in her, so he tormented her instead. And when death came, he was filled with remorse." Satterthwaite shivered. "But death ended it, didn't it?" "Death?" Quinn's voice was almost scornful. "You believe in life after death, don't you? Who's to say that desires, regrets, and unfinished business don't carry over? When the will is strong enough, a messenger is always found." Satterthwaite stood, his hands trembling. "I must return to the hotel." Quinn nodded but did not follow. "I'll go back the way I came," he said, his voice fading as he turned toward the cliff's edge. And when Satterthwaite looked back, Quinn was gone.